everyone could take their seats, we're going to kick off the biosecurity panel led by the RTIP's newest professor, Elizabeth Rogers. We're blessed to have Elizabeth here on our staff at the university. So take it away, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Robert. Hello, everyone. As he said, my name is Elizabeth Rogers, the new Assistant Professor of Practice with the University of Arizona Racetrack Industry Program. We're here today to talk about safeguarding equine health, biosecurity strategies for disease prevention and control. When I arrived in Tucson to take on this new role back in July, one of the first items Robert sent my way was a panel topic on biosecurity. For those of you that might be unaware, prior to being here, I was at Mahoning Valley Racecourse, where we had an outbreak of strangles. There was also a horse that ended up testing positive for EHV1. And that experience, if I were to sum it up in one word, it was tough. It was tough for my team, it was tough for the horsemen, and it was tough for the bottom line of the racetrack, of the horsemen, and it was not an easy thing to go through. So, with that in mind, I knew that this was a topic that we needed to talk about. So I'm proud to introduce this wonderful group of panelists that are joining us here today to talk about the topic of biosecurity. So at the end, we have Dr. Betsy Green. She's our state extension horse specialist with the University of Arizona. She'll be discussing educational resources for all industry participants and best practices to prevent disease spread and outbreak. Next up, I will have Dr. Jeff Blea, the Equine Medical Director with the California Horse Racing Board, who will walk us through practical applications at the racetrack. Dr. Ryan Walker, the State Veterinarian with the Arizona Department of Agriculture, who will highlight the role of the state regulatory veterinarian and also take a closer look at equine infectious anemia. And then finally, Dustin, the Director of Racetrack Operations at Sunland Park. He's going to be providing us a case study of EHV1 from when they had an outbreak at Sunland Park in 2016 and share with us his takeaways as a track operator from that experience. So, as you can see, we have an excellent group of panelists today. It's our hope that when you walk out of this room, that you will have tools, knowledge to take with you and take immediate action to improve biosecurity measures and to better protect our horses. So I am going to ask, please hold any questions till the end. We will open it up for the Q&A at the end of all the presentations. And without any further delay, as we have a lot to cover here, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Betsy Green.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Usually when I'm involved in this, it's after something's happened, and because I'm the educational aspect of this. And guess what? You can do this. What do I need to point it to? There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Oh yeah, that helps a lot, huh? All right, so guess what? Biosecurity is absolutely nothing new. Back in the 1900s, the veterinarians wanted to close all the public watering troughs, and if you look on that wonderful water source, former water source in Pennsylvania, there's a place for animals, horses, cattle, whatever, walking by apparently, dogs and people. And there was a bad case of glanders, which is one of those diseases we fortunately don't see around here much, if at all. But back in the 1900s, we were having disease issues. And it goes further back than that, even when we had, the students think that this is when the professors were born. And if you look at that star up there in Toronto area, they had about 600 cases. That was where things started for this very serious case of influenza. And if you look at those dates, 1872, within 3 months, the shades of where that disease passed. And so it was pretty fast moving, and you have a question as to whether or not anybody actually moved or went through that Montana and northern area, but basically a lot of the path of diseases was equal to the path of the horses and moving across and city centers and things like that. So it was a long time ago that we were dealing with this stuff, and now we're seeing things again as we go. But in general, biosecurity, we have practices and procedures that reduce the risk, doesn't prevent it always, but reduces the risk of infectious disease, healthier horses, fewer vet bills, sorry veterinarians, and client and employee safety, and also environmental health as well, depending on what we're talking about. But it's all about prevention. And usually we start looking at prevention after we're having to deal with an outbreak, which you'll hear a whole lot about as we go down this panel. But there are common routes of disease. Of course, you have vectors from biting insects to animal bites for equine infectious anemia, West Nile, Eastern Western Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis, rabies. You have fomites. I don't know if any of you would ever claim, but I'm sure that several of us over the time when we shared brushes when we were grooming yearlings in the farms passed some ringworms or towels and things, ringworms, strangles, things like that. Of course, water source, glanders, and other. And then influenza from a cough, a sneeze, whatever. If you look at that cold breathing horse there, that's just breath. Just imagine a sneeze. And you can imagine aerosol transmission is can go pretty far. And of course, core principles, maintain clean living environment, stalls, disinfecting, cleaning, and all that. Vaccination programs, prevention, of course, and then limiting exposure to sick horses or horses that you don't know the health history of. And then finally, have plans to prevent or control, which you'll hear about, the good, the bad, and the ugly for spreading disease when it does occur. So education is a key, but there's a lot of different ways that, different audiences, different ways that we present that. And sometimes there are so many simple things that you can do that can decrease the potential of disease. And so when you're talking about the people working directly with the animals, a lot of times some common sense of things that you just change the way you do things very minorly can make a difference. And I'll show you, we created, because education is, my business, so to speak, through as the extension horse specialist, we're trying to talk about preventing stuff as opposed to treating it. I'll show you some different angles of what you might present for common sense things to a little bit more in depth to the way in-depth materials as well. And one of the differences is, if, the old do as I say, not as I do kind of thing, that really doesn't work. Because if you want your people that are working in the barn to do what you're asking for disease prevention and things like that, you have to make it a priority. And one of the most simple things, you have to walk the talk too. One of the most simple things is a meme that we created, and don't double dip. And I can't tell you, I grew up putting that hose all the way in that water bucket so it didn't spray back on you, especially in winters in Massachusetts. But yet, if you put that hose in a water bucket of a horse that's sick, and then you transfer it to the next stall, and the next stall, you could be the typhoid Mary of the whole bunch, spreading that disease on the end of that hose. So just even taking that, not putting the hose in the water, or cleaning the buckets as well. And so we said, okay, don't double dip, because everybody has this mental picture of a little kid, whether they're slobbering all over something and then going back to the same ketchup that you were using with the French fry, and gives you the heebie-jeebies, or when they take a drink of your soda and half of it goes back in the bottle, okay? And so you remember that. And we actually have done things with fourth graders through 80-year-olds, and when you ask them, okay, what did you learn about preventing diseases and things, and they'll say, don't double dip. And it's okay, and that's one thing that's real simple. Another, if you're at the show or at the track or out, somewhere else, at a show, anywhere, then you don't think about the water trough. You're like, the horse needs water. Well, okay, but then you won't see that oil slick or snot in the water trough, but it could be there. And so sharing snot is not cool. And of course, the fourth graders really love that because they can say snot. But it's, again, something that you think about. Now, if you're out riding all day out in the Tucson desert and you come to a water trough, are you going to not let your horse drink because it might get a disease? Well, if it's going to die of heat exhaustion or dehydration, then you weigh the risks and you want your horse to live. So food for thought, common sense is always a good thing to keep. Okay, a couple things. Now, you say quarantine. You always hear 3 weeks, and you'll hear all about this kind of stuff down the line here. But the one thing you have to take home from this slide is most people don't have a great way to quarantine. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. Even an empty stall between a potentially sick horse or a new horse coming in is better than nothing. Okay, so that's food for thought, that you can't always be perfect, but being perfect and not doing anything is going to be worse than not. Okay, of course, if your horse is sick, don't take it to the show, don't take it to the track, leave it at home, because you don't want to have it get more stressed, more exhausted, and more sick, and then pass that on and then have a shutdown. Okay, so think about that, keeping the vaccinations, everything like that. And then for a little bit more detail, it's a funny thing when you ask people about vital signs, because that's one of the first ways you can find out if your horse is normal, feeling good, and they can rattle off the TPR. But when it comes down to it, then you say, show me how you take a mandibular pulse or whatever. And they're like, yeah, okay. So you can say new or refresher. There's publications. There's actually a handout at the back that has some disease information and QR codes to a lot of the resources that I'm showing right here. So in this, you can see there's good and bad and all that. That's one of the publications that you have access to from that. Another one, maybe for the owners or trainers, a little more detail as well, but also succinct so that it's understandable, not, no offense, vet speak, okay? And so these are a little, be on the lookout for, that we've created in Arizona when we've had some cases, strangles, EIA, things like that. And then more in-depth information. This is the EDCC, equine disease, and all you have to do is search equine disease control or center. It'll come up, and there's a lot of information on there. And of course, one thing you can do is you can actually go to the alerts, and sorry, Elizabeth, you might recognize this one. It was after you left, though.
Yes, it was.
Okay, but you click on Ohio, and you can see down there that strangles popped up at just after you left again. But you can actually look by state what alerts are happening, what's going on, and you may not want to be heading that way if if they have an active outbreak going on. So simple best practices: monitor horses for signs of illness, deviations in their normal vital signs, quarantine area, or even, again, some is better than none. A stall between or a paddock between. Arizona, that would be an open, rail pen with a shade between. And then quarantine new animals coming in or horses coming in that have been exposed to other animals. If you have, group them according to risk. Don't put the oldsters next to the the horses that are coming in from potentially active disease environments. And then limit exposure as much as you can for, when the resident horses that don't go anywhere. So those are some of the simple things that you can see as well. There's other options that you could actually have some checks for your facilities, and that's available in one of the publications, putting it to practice. And always remember that you have the lovely visitors that want to pet and feed every horse, and they can carry slobber from horse to horse or carrots or whatever the case. So, and you also don't necessarily know where they came from. Okay, the other potential danger, and you'll hear about this, how some of these things were handled, is your farrier and your vet. If they're coming from a barn unknown that it's sick yet, you know, that's one of those things that you need to make sure, and there should never be a problem asking, hey, can you scrub, clean, whatever, and you'll hear why after that. So some of the people that are right next to your animals could be potentially putting them at risk as well. So common sense all the way to extreme detail on these diseases will help potentially keep your horses safer. And that's what I have, so.
All right, thank you, Dr. Grain. And the cartoons, I hear there's a poster?
Yes, there's posters with those cartoons, memes, and several others in the back. There's one in English, there's one in Spanish as well, and then the publication, the handout as well, that has a lot of the QR codes, so you do not have to type in any websites, and you can get access to a lot of the different resources.
Perfect, thank you. Definitely a resource I wish I had known about much sooner. Thank you very much. All right, moving on, Dr. Blea.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me. If you'll oblige me, I'm going to diverge from the table and stand up for two reasons. One, I'm short, and as such, I can't see my slides over the table, so I apologize. So they asked me to talk about infectious disease at the racetrack and my experiences. And fortunately, we've had a few of them. Unfortunately, we haven't had two, they haven't been a problem. We've had two recent outbreaks. We've had an EHV1 outbreak and an EIA outbreak. I'm going to focus more on the EHV outbreak, especially at the racetrack. The important thing about your racetrack is to know your racetrack. Whether it's equine medical director, your chief veterinary officer, know your racetrack. In other words, know who your participants are, know who's on the backside, your trainers, your veterinarians, and have relationships with those individuals, either through management or through your equine medical director or through someone. But there has to be a conduit where there's relationships that are already developed, because that will determine which way your outbreak goes. So let's say you get an outbreak, or let's say you get a horse, or I get a phone call saying, I got a horse that had a fever 2-3 days ago and now the horse is neurologic. Or I've got a horse that's neurologic, he just ran. Right away, first thing we're going to do is, did you test it? Yep, I'm testing it. We're sending in blood. We're sending in nasal swabs, PCR. Is it isolated? Let's get this horse isolated. I then contact management. Management's aware of the situation. And we're fortunate in Southern California with First Racing to have someone like Dr. Benson, who I can communicate with her, tell her what's going on. She's already got the wheels in motion as to what needs to happen next. So I'm a little bit spoiled, but very fortunate, and I think it's kind of the gold standard as to how to do it on a racetrack. Again, you get that horse with a fever, 24, 48 hours later, that horse is neurologic. That is going to likely be an index case. That horse at that present time is your index case. He needs to be isolated. If the horse is not isolated and you have the opportunity to get that horse off the grounds, get him off the grounds. That's easier said than done, because referral clinics and farms, they don't want sick horses. Some are set up with isolation places. You can send those horses. If you can get them off the grounds, get them off the grounds safely. If you can't, plan B, you need to set up isolation. And in order to do isolation, you need to understand your layout of your barn. When you start looking at that index horse, you've got to figure out who else was exposed. Okay, what other horses were exposed? We had an outbreak this fall. Trainer had 2 separate barns. We had an EHV positive. Fortunately, the horse was sent to the hospital. So we had day 0 starting. Unfortunately, the trainer had horses in 2 barns, both of which were entered to run that weekend. racing office lost quite a few horses to scratches. We had to scratch those horses until we could figure out where the index case was located and what horses were around or surrounding that index case. Unfortunately, some horses that were scratched were in the auxiliary barn. The trainers understood, the owners are not happy. You're not their friend, but in the big scheme of things, hard decisions have to be made, and you got to look at the big picture. And at the end of the day, you have to, on the racetrack and even in performance horse, you have to remember two words. And if you remember two things, it's continuity of business. Everything you do, you have to keep continuity of business in the back of your mind. So once you identify the index horse, you identify those who are exposed, your biosecurity measures, that should have already been implemented. Like I said, in our case, we've got people already pulling up foot baths. We've got people pulling up fences. You've got yellow tape already being delivered. You've got mesh to separate the barns, separate the horses. How you do it is going to be dependent on your own location, your own situation. There's a magic 30-foot barrier that's used. It's used not only in the United States, but internationally. I think it's kind of an arbitrary number, but it's a good number to start. In other words, if you have a barn where you have at least one horse who's tested positive for EHV or any infectious disease for that matter, that barn will then become quarantined on the racetrack, and everything within 30 feet will be moved to other areas and monitored. You need a communication plan. In other words, too many cooks spoil the soup. You can't have too many Indians, not enough chiefs, and vice versa. Someone has to be in charge. Someone has to communicate with the practicing veterinarians. Someone has to communicate with management. Someone has to be in communication with the state health officers. And that's very, very important, because everybody starts calling everybody, and then all of a sudden you have a game of telephone. Believe me, that doesn't go well. So you want to have these things in place before you have an outbreak. Will you have an outbreak? Yes, you will. It's just a matter of time. So you want to identify your biosecurity measures, and you want to identify what's your communication plan going to be. And everyone needs to be at the table, especially management. So what are the goals when you have an outbreak? Well, we have an index horse. Now we have a barn of 48 horses quarantined. So what are we going to do now? Biosecurity is implemented. We're temping these horses twice a day. That horse, if he's still on the grounds, he will be isolated from other horses, stalls, both left and right, across and behind, as far as we can go if we have room to get that horse isolated as much as possible. Foot baths are important. PPE equipment is important for anyone that touches that horse. Additionally, you want to identify that barn as a quarantine area. Use yellow caution tape, homicide tape. The other important thing, especially on, and I'll speak to the racetrack, you need to put signs out. No one enters, no one exits, so forth, but they need to be not only in English, but in Spanish. Very important. In our case, with First Racing, they were able to put people at the entrance to the barn. You have a single entrance, single exit. There's someone there that makes sure that whoever comes in has to identify the reason they're coming in, and anyone that leaves must go through the foot bath. Anyone that's going to touch the infected horse must have PPE equipment. And that includes gloves, boots, full disposable gowns. Have those supplies somewhere in the back room at your racetrack. If you never use them, great, no big deal. But you will need to use them, and when you need them, it'll be a weekend and a 3-day weekend. So if you can have those stocked up, disinfectants, cleaning supplies, and PPE equipment, you want to have that to plan and prepare. We identify the exposed, we identify what's going on. The communication is going to come back into place. You have to communicate with the trainers, the grooms, the hot walkers. You don't want a trainer who's got 2 or 3 barns having exercise riders going in from the clean barn to the infected barn and back to the clean barn. You have to have a program that suits your needs on your racetrack. So anybody that leaves that quarantine barn, their next move is to leave the racetrack after disinfecting themselves. Supplies, as I said, State and regulatory officials are very, very important. You must, if you already haven't, you should develop relationships with your state regulatory officials or your state health officers. We're fortunate in California that I've got a very good relationship with the California Department of Food and Ag, and our 2 recent outbreaks and some other pseudo outbreaks over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm on the phone with them right away. The benefit of having that relationship is there's a mutual respect. If you're proactive in your racetrack, they will let you manage the outbreak. You prefer that, believe me, because if they come in and manage the outbreak, it becomes very convoluted. And it's frustrating, and then you're dealing with a different level of bureaucracy that we're not used to dealing with. So develop those relationships. If you have them, great, keep them. If you don't have those relationships in your state, develop them. When there is an infectious disease such as EHV or EIA or strangles, the labs that report those positives contact the state regulators before the trainers, attending vet, or the racetracks find out. So first call they'll make is call you, and that's what you want. Restrict the movement, that makes sense, horse, but also human. You've got to sit down with those trainers and talk to them and say, this is what is allowed. And you must be compliant as a trainer. And you have to explain to them the severity of the situation, because if this spreads from your barn to the next barn to the next barn, and we've got major racing calendars coming up in the spring or the fall, that's going to disturb business continuity. You don't want to do that. So everyone needs to be on the same page. Use signage, train the people, train the grooms. Bilingual is critically important on the racetrack. Everybody talks about going and disinfecting, and I know this is kind of a simple thing, but cleaning and disinfecting is important. And if you think about it, C comes before D. Everybody wants to run in and disinfect, but you look at your situation. Wood is a difficult material. Metal is a difficult material. All those mats. What do you do with shavings, the straw, the rice hulls that are in those stalls? Do you have an area separate where they can be disposed of that, in the case of strangles, that's not going to serve as a nidus for continued infection? So clean first and then disinfect. 1 part bleach, 10 parts water, great foot baths. Depending on what disease you have and you're affected by, there are resources available to give you particular substances to use to clean. Compliance is critically important. And in order to have compliance, there has to be communication. And that has to start, like I said, at the very beginning when you have a plan. Communication has to be accurate and timely. You have to have designated individuals or 1 individual. And you need to talk about what's going on and what the plan is, because you need to talk about that internally amongst track management and stakeholders and the horsemen. But you're going to need to talk about that publicly to the media and the press. Here are 3 resources that I put out there that I use quite often. And as was stated earlier, the EDCC, every racetrack should be checking the EDCC. It's a great educational tool for all infectious diseases. Dr. Nat White spearheaded this years ago. It is a great tool to see what's happening. You get current updates. When there is a disease outbreak, you get an email immediately. State health officers and veterinarians that identify infectious diseases post those on this website right away. You can do it by location. You can do it by disease type. Every racetrack should have this on their web browser. It's very, very helpful from a monitoring standpoint. United States Animal Health Association, this website has quite a few resources within it, depending on what infectious disease you're dealing with, whether it's EHV1, strangles, EIA, vesicular stomatitis, pyroplasmosis. And lastly, UC Davis Veterinary Medicine Center for Equine Health has a very good educational website to help horsemen understand basically the basics of what the disease is about and how you should manage it and test for it and expected outcome. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Dr. Blea.
Thank you, Dr. Blea. Can everyone hear me all right in the back? All right, thank you. All right. So, I'm Dr. Ryan Wolker. I'm the State Veterinarian of Arizona here. As you can imagine, if we're getting involved, it's probably not because of a good reason, and nobody generally wants to see us. Okay, having some technical difficulties.
Go back.
I just want to go forward, actually. That's what it's pressing.
Yep. They're working on it in the back.
So
So you
through
should be good now.
statutory authority, basically, all right. Through statutory authority, we're responsible for safeguarding animal health in the state for all livestock species, which includes horses. We enforce import requirements. In the case of equine, obviously that's CVI and negative Coggins test to come into the state. Statutory authority also gives us the latitude and the authority to go onto any premises to collect samples from any suspected diseased animals, and then to determine the outcome of that, depending on the situation. So, any person that violates a quarantine order when we are investigating an animal disease outbreak will often administer an administrative order. They would be guilty of a Class 2 misdemeanor for violation of that. That's kind of the teeth that we have through statute to try and enforce these situations here. What we want to know is where is disease, where isn't disease, what kind of dangerous contacts there are, and then trace-ins and trace-outs. So what animals have been in contact with the different stables or shed rows, et cetera. So we want to identify the index premises, institute quarantine. That could extend up to 6.2 miles, depending on the disease that we're dealing with, and obviously for a lot of things it's much smaller than that. 0 to 3 kilometers is considered the infected zone, and then 3 to 10 kilometers is considered the buffer zone. That's just a graphic there of kind of the general disease response formula. To speak to EIA specifically, we've had a fair amount of experience with this disease over the last few years. EIA was first recognized in 1888. It's a retrovirus, specifically a lentivirus. The natural mode of transmission is through biting insects, particularly tabinid flies, so like your horse flies. But iatrogenic transmission, so the process where needles or IV sets are shared between horses, pretty much all of our most recent outbreaks have all been attributed to some human component. Prevalence was around 4% in 1972 with the advent of the Coggins test to implement for interstate movement requirements. That has subsequently dropped to less than 0.01%. So that just kind of illustrates what a simple policy decision and having a test that you can test for that disease, what kind of magnitude that has on the overall disease prevalence. Sporadic outbreaks are typically associated with iatrogenic transmission, as I mentioned previously. It is incurable. No vaccine exists, and horses are lifelong carriers of this virus, so they do pose a threat to potentially all other horses around them. Clinical signs are often nonspecific. Intermittent fever, if you catch them early enough in the course of disease. Later on in the disease, they're often not febrile at all. And in fact, if you walk up to a given infected horse, you probably can't even tell that they are infected, which is concerning for this particular disease. Early on in the course of disease, you might see some yellow gums, sclera, so the whites of the eyes. That's related to the red blood cells being destroyed and then having to be dealt with in the body. Ventral edema, anemia in chronic situations there, and then again we have the carrier states. So to go through a scenario here that we dealt with a couple of years ago, we had an accredited veterinarian collected blood from a quarter horse racehorse that was intended to be raced at Turf Paradise back in December of 21. To give you some context here, this horse originally came from California. raced in an unsanctioned race up in Nevada in Pahrump, and then was imported into Arizona. None of those movements had any kind of CVI or Coggins test associated with them. The racetrack here, obviously turf, did require a negative Coggins test for this horse to run in a sanctioned race, and that's actually how we picked it up. So as Dr. Blea mentioned, state animal health officials often get notified of a positive test result from a lab before anyone else. So we reached out to this accredited veterinarian and started the investigation. They did follow up. The lab that did the original testing did do both the ELISA and the AGID test, and both were positive. Those samples were forwarded to the National Reference Lab and came up positive again. So we obtained the contact information for the trainer, the owner, met with the trainer and the property owner. There's a total of 7 horses on the property, very small property, it was like an acre. They had 4 race horses, and then 3 other kind of recreational horses, 1 little pony. And to just kind of give you some additional information here, this was in December, but these horses, in speaking with the owner, had been on premises for, at least the last 4 to 6 months. So, that puts us back into, June of 21. So obviously, prime fly season between June and, probably November, when temperatures were still high enough. We tested the animals on premises, and basically all 4 of the race horses were positive for equine infectious anemia. The 3 recreational horses were not. And, again, these horses are stable next to each other. They have nose-to-nose contact. They were stable next to each other for months on end, but it was just the race horses that were positive. So, administrative order was issued. We did end up ordering the euthanasia of those 4 horses. We did a 60-day follow-up quality assurance test on the remaining 3 horses, and they were negative. But during the course of this investigation, we were notified of another non-negative in the state. So that was January 1st, 22, and we were notified of an additional case. We tracked that one down and tested 47 horses on that other premises in Maricopa County. And on that other premises, we ended up getting 1 positive, but then several weeks later, we had 6 additional horses come up positive. So a total of 11 horses in this outbreak that were positive. In both situations, reuse of needles and IV tubing was identified as the cause. That second premises there, the one with the 47 horses, it was linked to a racing, unsanctioned racing operation in California, where they subsequently identified, I think, another 23 or 25 positive EIAs there. Bottom line here is that most modern outbreaks of equine infectious anemia do have a human component. The virus has changed significantly compared to how it behaved in the in the 70s. It's probably less virulent now, so the horses are often more well adapted to dealing with it long term, but that doesn't change the fact that they're potentially a risk to other horses around them. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Walker. I'll turn it over to Dustin Dix.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? When I was asked to speak on EHV, I've graduated from the Racetrack program about 30 years ago and thought I'd be speaking on a lot of different topics. I never dreamed it would be about EHV. So the students in the audience, you probably have to deal with this sometime in your career. We made a lot of mistakes. I talked to our in-house legal counsel, and he said that the statute of limitations has run out, so anything I say, we can't get sued over. So one of the first mistakes, thank you for laughing at that, by the way. One of the first mistakes I made personally was we have a trainer named Tony Blea who said, I have a brother named Jeff who's a veterinarian, you guys should give him a call, and nobody called him, so. But what he talked about, the continuity of business, blew up in our eyes at Sunland Park. This cover picture, for those, this is a great trivia question. This is a horse by the name of Collected, winning our Sunland Festival Stakes and should have won our Sunland Derby, who went on to win many races, ran second in the Breeders' Cup Classic to Gunrunner. And instead of the Sunland Derby, we renamed the stakes. We changed our stake schedule. I called Churchill and told him we're under a quarantine. We're not going to run the Sunland Derby. Otherwise, we'll have to send a horse on the grounds to the Kentucky Derby, because back then it was a 50-point race. And I got a huge laugh when I said there'll probably be a New Mexico bred in the Kentucky Derby. And oh, they'd never heard anything so funny. So this just brings back a lot of memories when I was asked to talk about this. I have actually file on my computer called EHV1 and started going through all my files and brought back a lot of memories. Dan Fick, who's in the front row, was the interim executive director of the Racing Commission. And those that know Dan's probably one of the most mild-mannered, nicest guys in the world. Came down to Sunland Park for a horseman's meeting, and the first thing he said, and Dan will not like me telling this story, I'm sorry, Dan. Sit down and shut up. And I said, Dan Fick said that? We know we're in some serious stuff right now. But what happened at Sunland Park, and I did a little timeline here, we had a horse named Another Dollar that was euthanized, and the veterinarian said there may be more to this, and we never really thought anything of it. And that was January 13th of 16. January 21, I'm at a commission meeting 4.5 hours away from Sunland Park in Albuquerque, and my boss, my general manager, and myself get called in to the back room of the commission, and my whole career never been called in, scared to death, had no idea what it was, and that's when we were informed this horse tested positive for EHV, the neurological strain, and we need to quarantine Sunland Park. So that's when we immediately quarantined Sunland Park. And we did this, we're 4 hours away. We did this by phone. We got the place quarantined. The time between January 13th and January 21, some horses left Sunland Park. So we went to the in and out slips, and we saw some horses went to Turf Paradise. So I contacted Turf Paradise and said, there's some horses that may have been exposed to EHV. One, when they get there, you should make sure they're isolated. And I thought they'd throw me a parade. Instead, lawsuit. So it's amazing the things that happened during this time. It was such a crazy time. The next day after the quarantine, the continuity of business, we wanted to keep that going. So we raced quarter horse and thoroughbreds. One of the quarter horse races we had to cancel because all the horses were from off the grounds. So it was just a mess. The livestock board took over a lot of this, and the livestock board, in conjunction with the Racing Commission and Sunland Park, we decided to halt racing and just start testing horses and try to get a handle of this. But that time frame between January 13th and January 21, in our offices, we had a list of all the barns and where the positives were, and it was just all over our barn area. So we had to shut down racing at that time. And that went from January 23rd to February 23rd, and we canceled 19 races, or 19 race days. So you could imagine just every day we'd meet every day to keep the communication lines open. And we were just going in a million different directions, answering questions. We were playing the game of telephone. I was taking calls from owners that their trainer wouldn't call them back, make sure my horse is okay, just on and on and on. Owners thinking it's because the grooms are peeing in the stalls. No, that's not the case. This is different type. This is EHV in horses. So it was just one thing after another. And we resumed racing February 26th and extended our meet May 3rd. And we actually ended up making up 9 race days we made up. So there was major continuity of business. And just kind of a review and impact, we had 73 horses tested positive for EHV1, but 12 were the neurological strain. 7 of those 12 recovered. 11 horses were put down. 6 of the 11 showed clinical signs, and 5 of the 11 were at the owner's request. Just to put a dollar figure on this, I was looking at my notes, and just a rough estimate, I saw the livestock board just on their end was over $100,000 for Sunland Park. It was well over $500,000 just of all the impact that it did. And we're not even talking about the long-term impact of what it did to racing. So this was just something that we hope could be avoided. What we learned was how this was spreading really was the human factor for EHV. And we didn't get buy-in right away. We have year-round racing in New Mexico. And some trainers use this as a time for vacation. Some went to the Super Bowl. They came back and they're like, what's going on? So we were relying on assistant trainers and grooms to try to get the message out. Once we restricted the humans, once we restricted humans from going from not just barn to barn, but from training center to the track, really tightening up things, traffic, everything. I mean, we heard this could be carried on the wheels of vehicles as well. I mean, like Elizabeth said, I got a crash course in EHV that year. But once we restricted the humans, we got buy-in from the horsemen, that's when we really started to get out of this. And one of the things that I got out of this, the one thing I could think of was Dr. Timoney came down from Kentucky and he said, you guys aren't special. EHV's in every barn area in North America. It's the one thing you guys need is a quarantine area, and not just a quarantine area on track, but you also ideally would like one off track to get these horses off your track in conjunction working with your agencies, the Livestock Board, Racing Commission, et cetera. And that would have really, we were scrambling. We had to create our own quarantine area. We built our own temporary stalls. So we were kind of behind the curve on that. So we learned quite a bit. One of the positives of this, I believe, is right now we're seeing EIA cases in our area, and horsemen no longer, this isn't a big joke, that they understand the ramifications. The ones that went through this said they don't ever want this again. So hearing the other doctors talk, a lot of this resonated with me, that a lot of this, it can fall apart pretty quickly. The main thing is to make sure you have a quarantine area, you have a plan in place, and that you got to get the buy-in from the people in the barn area. We put security at barns and told grooms, go through your foot, you didn't do your foot bath, and they'd shoot the finger at our security. So we started turning them into stewards and really hammering them, worked with the trainers, really got buy-in from the trainers, and we eventually got out of it. But it was really an experience that I don't want any track operator, any horseman to ever go through to the extent that we did. And the long-term effects of horse ownership, kind of the trends in the industry, I'm sure that had an effect as well. So I appreciate being on this panel, and hopefully for the students out there that they keep this in the back of their head, is that this is something you'll probably have to deal with in your career at some point. Elizabeth had to deal with it, I've had to deal with it, so it's you know, it could be EHV, it could be EIA, it could be strangles, it could be a lot of different things, and it's getting this information, knowing what to do, being proactive, keeping the communication lines open. So hopefully that resonates, especially with the students here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Dustin. Well, I think one thing that really stood out to me as you were speaking, Dustin, was the crash course comment that I think highlights the importance of why this panel discussion needed to be had to help educate. The last thing I think either of us want to see is somebody having to go through that crash course lesson, whether you're a track operator, whether you're a horseman in the barn. It's so devastating to the racing community when it happens. So getting the opportunity to come up here and educate our audience about biosecurity and how we can prevent it in the first place and lower that risk factor. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to any questions out there. Feel free to step forward. If you don't have any questions, I have a few. I think I see someone walking up. Welcome.
Hello and thank you. My name is Marilee Herrera. I'm a small owner out of Kentucky, and I'm sure you're very much aware of some of the concerns with biosecurity in the retaining barn, in the ship-in barn. My horses and trainer are based out of Keeneland, so in the winter we go up to Turfway, but my horses stay at Keeneland. Has there been any new developments, or have you seen an improvement on keeping those areas safe from contaminants as well as the drug contamination? Have you seen any improvements in some tracks?
Yeah, I think Dr. Blea or Dr. Green, either, probably this would be a good question.
And I think HISA is addressing this as well as
Yes.
part of the rulemaking.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, Dustin. HISA is addressing this in their rulemaking as far as code of standards for receiving barns or shipping barns. And part of it, there's a lot to it, but if you keep it basic, C before D, you got to clean before you disinfect. And I know in California that's what we do, so.
Right. Any other questions out there?
Hi, Dustin. Hey, Cynthia Smith, Director of Racing at the new quarter horse track in Nebraska. And, but I was just wondering about the Coggins. Is there going to be any time difference on when that, you know, it's a year, every year right now. Is that going to change? And would you, I mean, that issue would, you know, horsemen would have to incur costs, things like that, health records, whatever. So I just know that's been talked about, and I was curious if you guys had talked about it.
Thanks, Cynthia. I know at Sunland we're requiring a 30-day Coggins, and Zia Park required a 30-day for their meet because of the outbreak. So that was in conjunction with the Racing Commission. So that's a new requirement for us. It's usually a lot longer, but it's 30 days from when our barn area opens, December 19th. So it'd have to be from November 19th on.
Has there been, Dr. Walker, any, as far as Arizona, what's the standard in Arizona for Coggins?
So that's a good question, and to address that, so as far as the state regulations and rules go, pretty much across the board, it's universally 12 months that Coggins is good for. Now, private venues, whether they be racetracks or stables or other, you know, equine event facilities, they can dictate and set their own rules. So, you know, if you want to have a 30-day Coggins, that is completely up to the establishment setting those rules. That is not the state or the, you know, Department of Agriculture setting that parameter. That's the private venue. You know, in the face of, you know, a disease event, potentially, you know, the state animal health official there does have the latitude to execute, you know, a director's administrative order, and perhaps, you know, require all importation of, you know, equine into the state to have a Coggins within 6 months. But I don't really think that that's happened all too often. So pretty much 12 months is what the state would mandate in most states.
I see another question.
Hi, Ann McGovern with HISA. First, thank you to the panel. This is so important, and I appreciate all the information you're sharing. My question is really for the audience. I'm just curious, how many racetrack, are there any representatives from actual racetrack operators here? One?
See a few hands stinking up.
Because, I mean, that's where, well, Dustin, of course.
They might be in the next room over.
I mean, that's where this all starts. And it's so helpful for the horsemen to understand the process and how it protects them, but it really starts with the racetrack operators. And I really appreciate you sharing the information.
Thank you, and that is definitely our hope, I think, in this panel. Any other questions out there?
Yeah, I know, there's a height difference here. I actually had a question that kind of piggybacked off the first one and hers. You know, we talk about the contaminants between, you know, disease and drugs, and that. What does this look like in the conversation between the responsibility of the owners and the trainers and the tracks? Like, where does, in the conversation, where does that fall? Where do we see that falling on each person? And do the racetrack owner, like the racetrack operators, are we having that conversation? Are the trainers having that conversation with the owners? And have you guys thought about what that conversation looks like? And, you know, are people having that conversation amongst themselves of who's taking responsibility for, you know, I think of some of the lawsuits out there and people are trying to pass the buck on, well, you know, my groom peed in the corner of the stall and that's how the horse, you know, tested positive. So, you know, and you talk about, well, it was a, you know, the horse shared the water bucket and that's how somebody else got it. So, you know, what does that look like? Who's taking responsibility? I don't know if that was, the question had shape and didn't quite get there.
Well, Dustin, so do you have any thoughts from a track operator perspective on recommendations for racetracks to help?
Well, I think we're all in it together. It's working together. And I think that's kind of been the theme of this whole symposium is it's working together. It's sharing information and being proactive with this and getting that information so you can quarantine and be proactive. And I think the horsemen in New Mexico going through this, they understand the ramifications of a wrong move and what could happen.
Dr. Green, did you have any thoughts from a horseman perspective for how they can help out?
Well, it's hard because you have the regulatory factors that come in, and so the people, the trainers in charge of the animals, the tracks in charge of all of the animals, all still have to communicate with the veterinarians, but also with their owners who are not happy about any missed race or potential of a missed race and often looking to blame. So I think several people said open communication is a key, and it's got to be both ways, but informing them as much as you can so that the reality is going to happen, whether it's because Dr. Walker came in and made it so, because there was a positive, or whatever the case. You know, everything you can do to prevent it is the best, but you prepare people so that when it does happen, there's more willingness to deal with it, to make it less broad of a infection or outbreak.
If I might add, you know, culpability is what we're talking about, and mitigating circumstances. And drug positives are different than infectious diseases, but the basic culpability. But I would strongly advocate to avoid a lot of that and to mitigate that. A lot of that is education. And if you attack this from an educational standpoint with your communication, you're going to minimize a lot of those things a lot of times.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Ken McKeever from Rutgers in New Jersey. The predominant racing where I am is standardbred racing, and I'm asking this question for the folks in the industry where I am, because I'm at a university, and obviously they're a different situation, but trainers will truck in, truck out on a daily basis all over the region. We might have a trainer in New Jersey who goes up to Monticello or down to Delaware. There are a lot of moving parts there that put a layer of risk and, you know, need for mitigating circumstances. What would your recommendations be for the standardbred industry with that sort of paradigm for how they're handling horses?
Good luck. No, that's a great question, and that's, you know, that's one of the things that's so difficult from a regulatory standpoint, because you don't have any control once they leave that, you know, that enclosure, and they train at the farms. You know, you don't know what goes on at the farms. They ship in, they run, they ship out, and you know, you've got to deal with so many different layers of potential failures along the way. You know, and whether it's infectious disease or drug positives. That's a tough one, and that's a really, really good question. And, you know, Scott Palmer and I have had this discussion on numerous occasions, and it's frustrating because you don't have, they're not in the enclosure, so you don't have any regulatory authority over that. So it's hard.
Well, thank you everybody for your time and for being here. I appreciate it. If you have any other questions or panelists, you can come up and talk to them individually. Also, there are some resources in the back for you to take with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.